Ralph.
Hi, Jim. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Last week, we were taking a look at some vocabulary items in psychology, and we've had quite a number of people who have responded to our podcast of last week. And they want to know some more things that people get mixed up on. One person asked about subconscious versus unconscious. Another person asked about asocial versus antisocial. So I think we should take a look at some of those.
Okay, well, subconscious, as many things in psychology, goes back to Sigmund Freud.
Right.
And Freud said that the subconscious, at least in his early writings, he referred that to the region of the mind that lies immediately below the conscious, according to the study authors, although Freud later abandoned the term. So he used subconscious at first to mean that region of the brain that we couldn't access.
Not readily, at least. But
Not readily.
He thought it could be accessed through projective tests, like later on the Rorschach or the TAT test, that we'd get little glimpses into this kind of murky twilight zone. So that's subconscious, Freud's term. But how about unconscious? And we see this now being kicked around. We talked about it in our implicit bias course, right, Ralph?
Yeah, and that's referring to the part of the mind that is outside the awareness of our conscious or thinking mind.
Right. It's the kind of thing that, the Rorschach test or the TAT test would not readily get to. But it's, I guess, responsible for some of the attitudes and beliefs that we hold, like the superiority of our group versus their group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things that sometimes people who are deeply wedded to mental health as a profession sometimes say is that if you see the term unconscious, that means that something has been written or spoken by somebody who's not part of the mental health field. Well, that turns out maybe to be not entirely correct, because we do have beliefs that we cannot readily surface.
Yeah. In fact, that could be part of a prejudice within the field, which we'll get to in a few minutes.
Yeah. So, you say to yourself, well, prejudice, I'm not prejudiced. Well, you know what? Maybe you never speak about your prejudice, but maybe
it's affecting your behavior, perhaps.
It is affecting your behavior. And behavior is the real clue.
Mm-hmm.
So if you say, okay, I'm in a position where I'm financially independent and I'm going to hire somebody to be a cook and somebody else to be a maid and somebody else to be my butler.
Okay, and so you might choose people on what? Ethnic or racial lines. You might have a Latino gardener, a French maid, and an English butler. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And so you say, well,
that's just the way I want to do it.
Yeah,
and that's the unconscious part.
My butler should be English, because every movie I've ever seen that has a butler, the butler speaks with an English accent.
Jeeves does, yes.
Yeah, and my gardener should be Hispanic, because that's what they portray in the films.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so you end up with these things that are not accessible to your conscious mind readily. So if somebody said to you, well, suppose I gave you an American guy who was perfectly trained as a butler.
No, I wouldn't want him. I want a Brit.
I want a Brit, yeah.
We'll, we talked about this in our implicit bias course. Maybe next week we should talk a little bit about the work of Banaji and Greenwald with their implicit association measure. because they think that they can get at some of the stuff that's at the quotes unconscious level. Now, I mentioned prejudice versus discrimination. Okay, so if I think that the Brit guy is going to be a better butler than the American guy, is that prejudice?
Well,
I think so.
I think so, yeah.
And
And the answer, I guess, is that we all, to one extent or another, have prejudices. You know, you can get into a furious argument if you happen to be in the right saloon or coffee shop and you say something about Chevy is better than Ford.
or the Lions are better than, or Green Bay Packers are better than the Lions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the next thing you know, you'll have every patron in the place choosing up sides and ready to duke it out, at least verbally.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, we all have prejudices, but it reaches the level of discrimination
When it's
behaviorally.
behaviorally, yeah.
So when we act out, that's
Okay, so when I choose the British butler as opposed to the American butler candidate, I'm actually acting on discrimination, right?
yeah,
So it's not a belief; it's an actual behavior.
it's an actual behavior. So you might, if I might say to you theoretically, uh, Jim, who do you like to play a game of basketball with? Do you want a guy who's 7'6", or do you want a guy who's 6'2"? No,
Where are you going with this one, Ralph?
well, the rational decision
It's
is
the
to say
7 foot guy.
the 7 foot guy.
Yeah.
But suppose the 7 foot guy is completely clumsy and trips over his own feet and can't dribble worth a darn.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in that case, probably the shorter guy is maybe a better choice.
Okay, so I'd go with better player, the one I thought was the better player. Now, if I was just choosing based upon height, 7 foot versus 6 foot, that would be what? A prejudice, thinking that the big guy is better. But if I'm looking for ability, that would not necessarily be prejudice, would it?
No, that would be making a rational decision.
Okay.
So sometimes we have to say, well, I made a rational decision that the British guy would be a better butler.
Yeah, but I might have been wrong.
You might have been wrong.
And so I have to go with my behavior. I have to follow up with that in some way.
Yeah.
You're kind of going into another direction here, Ralph, and that's one of the things that someone has asked about, and that's how about ethnicity versus race? People mix that one up quite a lot. In fact, we talked about that with Uruk, remember?
Yeah.
And he proved to me that I was not white.
Yeah.
If I look at my tan right now, I'm not quite as brown as Uruk, but getting there.
Yeah. And I could say without fear of contradiction, because I have not been in the sun as much as you have gardening this summer, I'm whiter than you are.
You definitely are. Okay, so often with race, we think of things as being different in terms of biological makeup. That somehow somebody who has got really dark melatonin is quotes racially different than somebody who's got white skin like you do, Ralph. Unfortunately, that is just not right.
It's not right.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we know that is not right from is the fact that you could take somebody who is Asian, somebody who is Middle Eastern, somebody who is African, and somebody who is Scandinavian.
Do DNA studies?
And do DNA studies, or more pragmatically say, I'm a white person, but I fell in love with this Mideastern, Asian, black person, and we got married and we have children.
Mm-hmm.
So are we the same race? Well, of course we are. We can interbreed.
Okay, yeah. We're not Neanderthals yet, or were. So I don't know where I went with that, but so race is a biological construct, which is probably not accurate. It's probably meaningless at this point. Whereas ethnicity has to do with how you see yourself as a Scandinavian or a Middle Easterner or a Scot or
Yeah.
Irish. Okay, so we can
So
see
cultural, linguistic, national, religious, all of these things come into play when we talk about ethnicity.
right. Another of the concepts that was asked about had to do with antisocial versus asocial. Now, we've used those terms before, here in our podcast, but, well, according to you, Ralph, what does antisocial mean?
Well, an antisocial person is a person who chronically withdraws from others.
That's more asocial.
Well, someone who,
Yeah, an asocial person just doesn't like to interact very much with other people. It's not that
yeah,
they're mean,
so
they're not nasty, whereas the antisocial person might interact a lot with individuals, but
in a
might,
negative way.
yeah, because
So, do you remember the movie Tornado?
something about a card, right?
Yeah, and it's
Clint Eastwood.
Clint Eastwood,
Yeah.
and he plays in this movie because at the time the movie was made, he was an old man. He plays a grumpy old man,
Okay.
and his famous first line in the movie is "Get off my lawn."
Okay.
So he's antisocial.
No, wouldn't he be asocial?
Well, he withdraws from people, but when he interacts with them, he's grumpy
Okay.
and he's negative.
All right.
And there are Asian people in the neighborhood, and he says he hates them. Now, he's a veteran of the Vietnam War, so, this is where he picked up his antisocial ideas about Asian people.
Mm-hmm. When I worked in the prison, I met a lot of people who were antisocial. They did things, they behaved in ways that are just against society's norms. For example, knocking down a little old lady in the street and stealing her purse, or breaking a window, climbing in, and taking television sets, out of a residence, or uh, engaging in rape. I mean, those are definitely antisocial acts, right?
Yeah.
They're behaving in ways to get something. Whereas Clint Eastwood in Tornado really wasn't getting anything. He was just, not a person who was social within his own skin, within that environment. I think
Yes.
see, it's a tough concept. Even you and I are debating it a little bit.
And the thing is that you can say, well, I'm introverted and antisocial,
I'd say
or I'm extroverted and social. But you can also say, I'm extroverted and antisocial, or I'm extroverted and asocial.
Okay. I think it would be hard to be extroverted and asocial. Can't think of how that would work, but extroverted and antisocial, those two go together. I can't think of a good candidate at this point. You mentioned Clint Eastwood. Somebody who just doesn't kind of get the flow of humanity. That's the person who's just not fitting into the social aspect, but that person could be law-abiding, they could be hardworking. They just don't really dig people all that much, and people interactions. So you can see that some of these psychological terms that we're talking about kind of cut both ways. They're not always easy to understand.
And I can give you an example of a person who is introverted and at the same time well socialized, because by nature I'm introverted. I would just as soon be at home reading a book as anywhere. But if I go into a classroom, I can be very outgoing and extroverted.
Okay.
But that's a learned behavior.
Yeah, we've talked about that before. That's the mask that you put on, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So we hope that some of these, even though you're listening to Ralph and I, you can see that we've got some discussion going on as to what these terms mean. Let's click on one more term that we hadn't planned on, Ralph. Let's talk about empathy versus sympathy. You want to do that?
Okay, sure.
Okay. Now, empathy is something that we psychologists would like to think that we display in our interactions with other people, particularly for clinical psychologists, in our interactions with our clients. So empathy is kind of giving yourself into another person's shoes, understanding what's going on with them, understand their feelings, their emotions, understand what they're going through. Whereas sympathy is
something bad has happened to me, and you say, "Oh, I'm so sorry that happened."
yeah,
And you can do that kind of in two ways. You can do it from a place of empathy, where you're really, in the words that are often bandied about now, I feel your pain.
uh-huh.
Or you can just say, kind of socially, oh, I'm sorry that happened.
Yeah, right. And then you can dismiss it and go on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sympathy is not, I think, as powerful as empathy, trying to understand what the individual is experiencing.
And there's kind of a saying that goes along with empathy, and that is never judge a person until you've walked a mile in their moccasins.
Uh-huh.
So, you have to really be able to put yourself in their place and say, if this happened to me, how would I feel? That's probably about how the person it happened to is feeling. Gee, that's tough.
Mm-hmm.
And so you say to them, I'm sorry that happened to you, and you really kind of are feeling it.
Okay. So we've unpacked a few of these today. And I think, Ralph, next time, let us look particularly at that notion of unconscious. And unconscious as it affects our behavior, and unconscious as it applies to implicit bias.
We can do that. And that would be, I think, a good thing, because, a lot of people, and I think you had the classic example of the nurse who said, I don't have any prejudices. I got into healthcare to help people. Well, yeah, but that doesn't really say whether you have things that you're not prepared to talk about.
Yeah, right. Well, one of the things I'd like to talk about just at the end here, Ralph, is that as you go down our sheet, our liner notes, it says, here are the courses that we're offering. Right now, I think we've got 6 of them. And implicit bias is one, trafficking is another, human trafficking, and then there are 4 others. We're working on one right now on ethical issues and boundary issues, that is, violations of in this particular case, intimacy and sexuality in relationships. I'd like you to take a look at them, and if you need to earn continuing ed credit for your license, for example, this is where you can go. They're reasonably priced, and they are packed with, each of the courses is packed with information and packed with Ralph and I.
And for good or ill.
And if you can't do that, I'd ask you to consider one thing. Buy the boys a coffee.
That would be great. We need more coffee.
So until next time, this is Jim.
And Ralph.
Saying,
keep your stick on the ice.
As we're all in this
together.